The barn groaned like a dying animal as Margaret clutched her impossibly swollen belly, rainwater streaming through rotted boards above. At 68, she shouldn't be pregnant. The doctors had said it was medically impossible. But here she was, 9 months along, taking shelter with Harold in this collapsing structure on the outskirts of their small Montana town. Harold's flashlight beam swept across the interior, illuminating something that made his blood freeze. Dozens of yellowed photographs were pinned to the far wall, all of Margaret but younger, much younger, and beside them, newspaper clippings from 1955, local girl vanishes without trace, and search called off for missing teen. Margaret's face went white as she stared at evidence of a life she'd buried for over 50 years. The woman Harold had married wasn't who she claimed to be. She'd been running from something or someone, and now, with this impossible pregnancy, her past was catching up. The baby kicked violently as if responding to the revelation. Outside, car engines approached through the storm. But what secret could be so dark that Margaret erased her entire existence to escape it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's knees buckled as another contraction tore through her. Harold caught her arm, his weathered hands trembling, not from her weight, but from the impossible scene before them. The photograph showed a girl of perhaps 16, her hair in victory rolls, wearing the kind of dress girls wore to church socials in the 50s. The same delicate nose, the same determined chin. It was undeniably his wife, frozen in time on this rotting wall. "Maggie," Harold whispered, using the name he'd called her for 43 years of marriage. "What is this place?" She couldn't answer. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and she doubled over with a cry that echoed through the decaying structure. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether her past had finally found her or not. Harold's flashlight illuminated more details that made his stomach churn. Beneath the newspaper clippings were handwritten notes in careful script, seen at bus station in Billings, February 15, 2055. False lead in Denver, March 22, 2055. Still searching. She cannot hide forever. The writing looked fresh despite the yellowed paper, as if someone had been maintaining this shrine for decades. "We have to leave," Margaret gasped between contractions. "Now, before they—" "Before who what?" Harold demanded, but the approaching headlights through the storm answered his question. 3 vehicles, maybe 4, their engines growing louder despite the howling wind. Margaret gripped his sleeve with surprising strength. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever happens, don't let them take the baby. Promise me, Harold. Whatever you've believed about me, about us, promise me that." "I don't understand any of this," he said, helping her toward the barn's back entrance. But his feet felt rooted to the spot as his flashlight beam caught something else on the wall. A birth certificate dated 1937, bearing Margaret's face, but a different name entirely, Elena Vasquez. The math hit him like a physical blow. If this document was real, Margaret wasn't 68. She was 87 years old, though she looked exactly as she had the day he'd met her in 1981. Not a day older, not a grey hair different. "That's impossible," he breathed. "So is this pregnancy," she shot back, her voice sharp with pain and fear. "So is the fact that I've looked 35 for the past 70 years. So is the fact that this baby—" Another contraction cut off her words. The car engines had stopped. Doors slammed in the storm and voices carried through the wind. Urgent, organized searching. Harold's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was seeing. The woman he'd loved for 4 decades, who'd shared his bed, his dreams, his quiet retirement, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, she was something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. But as another contraction racked her body, and she looked at him with eyes full of terror and desperate love, none of that mattered. Whatever she was, whatever she'd done, she was still the woman who'd held him through his cancer treatments, who'd laughed at his terrible jokes, who'd chosen to share this impossible pregnancy with him. "Through the back," he said, making his decision. "My truck's about a quarter-mile through the trees. They'll follow us," Margaret whispered. "Then we'll figure it out as we go." Harold took her arm, steadying her as they moved toward the rear of the barn. "But first, you're going to tell me everything, starting with who you really are." Outside, flashlight beams pierced the darkness, growing closer. Margaret's water broke just as the barn's front doors exploded inward. The rain hammered against the kitchen window as Margaret stared at the plastic stick in her trembling hands. The second pink line remained stubbornly visible, mocking 40 years of medical certainty. She had gone through menopause at 52. The doctors had been clear her reproductive years were behind her. "Harold," she called, her voice barely audible above the storm. He appeared in the doorway, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a crossword puzzle still clutched in his weathered fingers. At 68, Harold moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to respect his joints, but his mind remained sharp as the day she'd married him. "What's wrong, Maggie?" He noticed her pallor immediately, the way she gripped the bathroom counter for support. She held up the test without speaking. Harold's eyes widened behind his glasses, and he set the puzzle down on the vanity with exaggerated care, as if any sudden movement might shatter the impossible reality before them. "That's not possible," he whispered, moving closer to examine the test. "The doctor said—" "I know what the doctor said." Margaret's voice cracked. "I took 3 tests. They're all positive." Thunder crashed overhead and the lights flickered. Harold reached for her, pulling her into his arms as she finally allowed the tears to come. They stood there in their small bathroom, surrounded by the familiar chaos of 43 years of marriage, her reading glasses on the sink, his blood pressure medication lined up like tiny soldiers, the framed photo of their grown children on the shelf. "We need to see Dr. Morrison," Harold said finally. "It's Saturday night, and there's a storm. Then we'll go tomorrow." First thing, he pulled back to look at her face, brushing a strand of grey hair from her forehead. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out." Margaret nodded, though nothing about this felt like something they could simply figure out. At her age, a pregnancy would be dangerous, potentially fatal. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a strange electric anticipation she couldn't name. The power went out just as they reached the living room. Harold fumbled for the flashlight they kept on the mantel while Margaret sank onto the couch, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. In the darkness, with only the sound of rain and wind, the news felt even more surreal. "The generator's in the shed," Harold said, clicking on the flashlight. "Don't go out there." Margaret's voice was sharp with sudden panic. "Please, just stay with me." He studied her face in the weak beam of light, seeing something that went beyond the shock of their discovery. Margaret had always been the steady one, the rock that held their family together through job losses and health scares and the ordinary turbulence of raising 3 children. This vulnerability was new. "Of course," he said, settling beside her on the couch. "The power will come back." But as the storm intensified, rattling the old farmhouse windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof, they both knew it would be a long night. Margaret curled against Harold's side, listening to his steady heartbeat and trying to process what was happening to her body. "Do you remember when I was pregnant with Sarah?" she asked quietly. "You craved pickles and ice cream, drove me to the grocery store at midnight more times than I can count." Margaret smiled despite everything. "You never complained." "I was terrified," Harold admitted. 25 years old and about to be a father. I had no idea what I was doing. And now we're almost 70, and we still don't know what we're doing." They sat in comfortable silence, the flashlight beam creating a small circle of safety in the darkness. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to be growing stronger, whistling through gaps in the old house's siding like voices calling from another world. "Harold," Margaret said suddenly, "what if this isn't natural?" He turned to look at her, though her face was mostly shadows. "What do you mean? What if something's wrong with me? What if it's not a baby at all, but something else? A tumor or—" "Don't," Harold's voice was firm. "Don't go down that road. We'll get answers, but tonight we're just going to hold on to each other and wait for the storm to pass." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to sink into his certainty and let it carry her through the fear. But deep in her bones, she felt something shifting, something that had been dormant for decades stirring to life. It wasn't just the impossible pregnancy. It was as if the storm itself had awakened something inside her, something that whispered of secrets buried so deep she'd forgotten they existed. The lights flickered back on, just as another tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, and Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her stomach, as she felt, for the first time, an unmistakable flutter of movement within. The silence in Dr. Henley's office stretched until Margaret felt it might snap like a taut wire. She gripped Harold's hand, his wedding ring pressing against her palm, a small anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. "That's impossible," Harold said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret is 68 years old." Dr. Henley adjusted his glasses and glanced at the ultrasound screen again, as if hoping the image might have changed in the last 30 seconds. "I understand this is unprecedented, but the tests are conclusive. Mrs. Whitmore, you are approximately 12 weeks pregnant." Margaret's free hand moved instinctively to her abdomen. She had attributed the subtle changes in her body to aging, the slight weight gain, the fatigue, even the nausea she'd dismissed as stress from their recent move to Millbrook. They'd relocated here 6 months ago, seeking the quiet retirement they'd dreamed of after 43 years of marriage. "This violates everything we know about human biology," Harold continued, his scientific mind struggling to process the information. He'd been a research chemist before retirement, a man who lived by data and empirical evidence. "Menopause is irreversible. Margaret went through it 20 years ago." The doctor nodded slowly. "I've consulted with colleagues in reproductive endocrinology. There are documented cases of pregnancies in women over 50, even a few in their early 60s, but nothing like this. Your hormone levels, Mrs. Whitmore, are those of a woman in her 20s. Margaret found her voice at last. "How is that possible? I wish I had an answer. We'd like to run additional tests, perhaps consult with specialists at the university hospital." "No." The word escaped Margaret's lips with surprising force. Both men looked at her. "I need time to think. We need to go home." Dr. Henley leaned forward, concern creasing his features. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is overwhelming, but given the unprecedented nature of your condition, medical supervision is crucial. The risks—" "What risks?" Harold interrupted. "At any advanced maternal age, there are complications. But at 68, Dr. Henley spread his hands helplessly. "We're in uncharted territory. We need to monitor both mother and baby closely." Margaret stood abruptly, Harold's hand slipping from hers. The room seemed to tilt, and she steadied herself against the examination table. Through the window she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and ominous against the late afternoon sky. "Margaret?" Harold was beside her, his hand on her elbow. "Are you all right?" She wasn't all right. Nothing was all right. For 68 years she had known exactly who she was. Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore, née Caldwell, born in St. Louis, raised by loving parents, married to her college sweetheart. She had grieved when they couldn't have children, had eventually found peace with their childless life, and now, impossibly, improbably, life was growing inside her. But it was more than the pregnancy that unsettled her. In the past few weeks, she had been experiencing strange dreams, vivid, unsettling images of places she'd never been, faces she didn't recognize but somehow felt she should know. And sometimes, when she caught her reflection unexpectedly, she looked younger, not dramatically, but enough that she'd started avoiding mirrors. "We'll call you," Harold told Dr. Henley, as he gathered Margaret's purse and helped her into her cardigan. "Thank you for being so thorough." The drive home was silent except for the rumble of approaching thunder. Their cottage sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, surrounded by rolling farmland and bordered by woods that seemed deeper and darker than when they'd first moved here. Margaret watched the landscape blur past and felt an odd sensation, as if she were seeing it for the first time, and yet had somehow known it all her life. "We'll figure this out," Harold said as they turned into their driveway. "There has to be a logical explanation." Margaret nodded, but she wasn't thinking about logic anymore. She was thinking about the dreams, about the way certain corners of Millbrook felt familiar despite her certainty that she'd never been here before their move. She was thinking about the old woman at the grocery store who had stared at her with undisguised shock and whispered, "It can't be, not after all these years." Most of all, she was thinking about the photograph she'd found in the cottage's basement when they'd moved in. A picture of a young woman who looked exactly like Margaret at 20, standing in front of what appeared to be this very house. A photograph that, according to the date stamped on the back, had been taken 3 years before Margaret was born. Thunder cracked overhead as they reached the front door, and Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Something was happening to her, something that defied explanation, and she had the growing certainty that the answers lay somewhere in Millbrook's past, a past that seemed increasingly connected to her own impossible present. The storm had passed, leaving the barn damp and filled with the scent of wet wood and earth. Margaret sat on an overturned crate, her hands still trembling as she stared at the photograph Harold had found tucked behind the loose board. The image showed a young woman who looked exactly like her, standing beside a man in a doctor's coat outside what appeared to be a medical facility. "I don't understand," she whispered, though something deep in her mind was stirring, like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a still pond. "That woman, she looks exactly like me, but I've never seen this place before." Harold knelt beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. The impossible pregnancy that had driven them to seek shelter seemed almost secondary now to this discovery. He pointed to the back of the photograph, where someone had written in faded blue ink, "MK, Final Session, 1975. "Margaret Catherine," Harold said slowly. "Those are your initials." "But I would have been 21 in 1975. I was working at the library in Millfield, remember? We met that same year." Margaret's voice carried a note of desperation. "I remember our first date, the movie theater, how nervous you were." Harold's expression grew troubled. He'd been thinking about that year, about how Margaret had appeared in Millfield seemingly from nowhere, with no family, no past that extended beyond a few months. At the time he'd found her mysterious nature romantic. Now it felt ominous. "Tell me about before Millfield," he said gently. "Before we met." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She tried to reach back into her memories, but it was like grasping at smoke. There were fragments, flashes of white rooms, the sound of machinery, voices speaking in hushed tones, but nothing concrete, nothing that formed a complete picture. She began, then stopped. A sharp pain shot through her temples, and for a moment the barn seemed to spin around her. "I can't remember. Why can't I remember?" Harold helped her to her feet as she swayed. Through the barn's broken windows, late afternoon sunlight was beginning to filter in, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. He knew they should leave soon, return home, and try to process everything that had happened. But something told him they weren't finished here yet. "Look," he said, pointing to another loose board near where they'd found the photograph. "There's something else." Together, they pried the board away, revealing a small metal box wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside, Harold found a collection of documents that made his blood run cold. Medical records, consent forms, and research notes, all bearing Margaret's name, or rather the name Margaret Catherine Henderson, not Margaret Catherine Wells, as he'd known her for 47 years. The documents spoke of experimental treatments, memory modification protocols, and something called Project Renaissance. Margaret's hands shook as she read phrases like complete personality integration and subject, shows no recollection of previous identity. "This can't be real," she said. but her voice lacked conviction. The strange pregnancy, the dreams she'd been having of white rooms and masked figures, the inexplicable knowledge that had been surfacing in her mind, it was all connected. Harold found a letter at the bottom of the box, written in Margaret's own handwriting, though neither of them recognized the words. "If you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. They promised the memories would stay buried forever, but I can feel them trying to surface. The baby changes everything. I need you to know the truth about what they did to us, about what we were before. Find Dr. Samuel Morrison. He's the only one who can explain what we really are. Don't trust anyone else. They're still watching. M." The letter was dated just 3 months ago. Margaret sank back onto the crate, her face pale. "I wrote this. I can see myself writing it, but I don't remember doing it. How is that possible?" Harold's mind raced through the implications. The pregnancy at their age, Margaret's recent strange behavior, her sudden knowledge of things she'd never learned. What if their entire life together had been built on a lie? What if Margaret wasn't even the woman he'd married? "We need to find this Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his thoughts. Margaret nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. What if we don't like what we find? What if everything we believed about ourselves, about us, is wrong? Harold took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin, the wedding ring he'd placed there decades ago. Whatever the truth was, whatever they had been before, the life they'd built together was real. The love he felt for her was real. "Then we'll face it together," he said, "just like we always have." But as they prepared to leave the barn, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and that their discovery was exactly what someone had been waiting for. The barn door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made Margaret's stomach clench. Harold fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the pale beam cutting through the oppressive darkness and revealing dust motes dancing in the stale air. The storm's fury seemed muted now, reduced to a distant rumbling that made the old structure creak and sway. "Jesus, this place gives me the creeps," Harold muttered, sweeping the light across weathered wooden beams and rusted farm equipment. "How long do you think it's been abandoned?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Something about the barn felt familiar in a way that made her skin crawl, not the comfortable familiarity of recognition, but the unsettling kind that whispered of half-remembered dreams. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the impossible life moving within her, and tried to shake off the sensation. 20 years, maybe more, she finally said, though she wasn't sure how she knew that. The words had simply emerged, unbidden and certain. Harold's flashlight beam swept past a collection of old milk cans and landed on something that made them both freeze. In the far corner of the barn, partially hidden behind a collapsed workbench, was a door. Not a barn door, but a proper interior door, complete with peeling white paint and a tarnished brass knob. "What the hell is that doing here?" Harold moved closer, Margaret following despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "It looks like it was ripped right out of a house." As they approached, Margaret could see that Harold was right. The door frame was intact but jagged at the edges, as if it had been cut away from surrounding walls with violent haste. Dark stains marked the white paint, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Harold reached for the knob, but Margaret grabbed his wrist. "Don't!" "Why not?" "It's just an old door, Maggie." But it wasn't just an old door, and somehow Margaret knew that with bone-deep certainty. Behind that door lay answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find, secrets that would change everything. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if it too sensed the danger lurking in this place. "Please," she whispered, "let's just wait for the storm to pass and get out of here." Harold studied her face in the pale light. "You're scared, really scared. What aren't you telling me?" Before Margaret could answer, lightning flashed outside, and in that brief moment of illumination streaming through the barn's gaps, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Carved into the door's surface, barely visible beneath layers of paint, were words. She couldn't make them out clearly, but her heart began racing as if her body recognized what her mind couldn't quite grasp. "Give me the light," she heard herself say. Harold handed over the phone, and Margaret approached the door with trembling hands. She traced the carved letters with her finger, feeling the grooves beneath the paint. The words were crude, hurriedly etched, as if someone had been desperate to leave a message before time ran out. "M-A-R-Y," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Mary Elizabeth Connor, 1954. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the barn floor. The light spun wildly before settling at an angle that cast grotesque shadows across the walls. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Harold's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Who is Mary Elizabeth Connor?" But Margaret couldn't speak. The name echoed in her mind, unlocking doors she hadn't even known existed. Suddenly she was 5 years old, crying in a strange woman's arms while someone she'd called Mama for her entire short life was led away in handcuffs. She was 10, being told her new name was Margaret Walsh, and she must never ever speak of her life before. She was 16, waking from nightmares about a white door and the taste of copper in her mouth. "I am," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like a confession. "I'm Mary Elizabeth Connor." Harold retrieved the phone, his movements mechanical as shock settled over him. "That's impossible. Your name is Margaret Walsh. You were born Margaret Walsh in Portland. I've seen your birth certificate." "Forged." The word came out with absolute certainty. Everything was forged. "Harold, I think I was kidnapped when I was 5. The people who raised me, they weren't my parents." The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to her emotional turmoil. Margaret doubled over slightly, gasping as pain shot through her abdomen. "We need to get you to a hospital," Harold said, moving to support her. "This stress, at your age, with the pregnancy—" "No." Margaret straightened, her eyes fixed on the door. "We need to know what's behind there. I've been running from this my entire life without even knowing it. The pregnancy, finding this place, it's all connected somehow. I can feel it." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the sudden silence that followed, they both heard it. The soft sound of footsteps approaching the barn from outside. The barn fell silent, except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against weathered wood. Margaret clutched the yellowed photograph, her hands trembling as she studied the faces staring back at her. The woman in the center bore an unmistakable resemblance. The same delicate jawline, the same startling blue eyes that Margaret saw in mirrors. "This can't be right," she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, fragments of half-remembered dreams flickered through her mind. A woman's voice singing lullabies in a language she couldn't identify. The scent of lavender and something else, something medicinal and sharp. Harold moved closer, his flashlight beam steady on the photograph. "Margaret, look at the back." With shaking fingers, she turned the picture over. Written in faded ink were the words, "Elena Vasquez, age 3, 1958. May God protect her from what we've done." The date hit her like a physical blow. 1958. The year she'd been told she was born. The year her parents claimed they'd adopted her from a Catholic orphanage in Chicago. "Elena," Harold said softly. That's not my name." Margaret finished, but uncertainty crept into her voice. Deep in her subconscious, something stirred at the sound of it, a flicker of recognition that made her stomach lurch. She set the photograph aside and reached for more documents from the metal box. Her fingers found a manila envelope sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Inside were medical records, forms stamped with official seals, and what appeared to be a birth certificate. But not hers, at least, not the one she knew. The certificate listed Elena Rosa Vasquez, born March 15, 1955, to Maria Vasquez and father unknown. Location of birth was listed as a private clinic in Millbrook, this very town they'd fled to for anonymity. "This says I'm 3 years older than I thought," Margaret breathed. "How is that possible?" Harold studied the documents over her shoulder. "These look official. Government seals, doctors' signatures." He paused, pointing to a notation in the margin. "Look at this. Subject transferred to Brightwood Initiative, classified level 7. The word sent a chill down Margaret's spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Brightwood Initiative. She'd never heard the name before, yet it felt familiar in the worst possible way. More papers revealed themselves as she dug deeper. Psychological evaluations filled with clinical language that made her skin crawl, references to enhanced cognitive development, genetic anomalies, and reproductive modifications. One report, dated 1961, contained a paragraph that made her blood run cold. Subject E-47. Elena continues to respond favorably to memory suppression treatments. Previous identity successfully replaced with constructed background. Foster placement with the Morrison family has provided adequate cover. Recommend continued monitoring through adulthood to assess long-term viability of genetic modifications. The papers slipped from her hands. Subject E-47. They'd reduced her to a number. Margaret. Harold's voice seemed to come from very far away. There's more. He'd found another section of documents, these more recent. Medical charts from the 1980s, tracking something called dormancy periods and activation triggers. The handwriting was different, more modern, but the subject designation remained the same, E-47. They've been watching me, she said, the realization washing over her like ice water. All these years, they've been watching. A photograph fell from between the medical charts. This one was recent, taken through a telephoto lens, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Margaret and Harold at their kitchen table just 3 weeks ago, the morning after they'd learned about the pregnancy. Harold was holding her hand, and her other hand rested protectively over her still flat belly. Someone had been watching them. Someone knew about the baby. Harold picked up the photograph, his face grim. This was taken from outside our house, from the old oak tree by the property line. He looked up at her. Whoever took this was close enough to see through our kitchen window. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. The impossible pregnancy, her manufactured identity, the decades of secret monitoring. It was all connected. But connected to what? And why, after nearly 7 decades of dormancy, was something happening now? Thunder crashed overhead, and in its aftermath, they heard something that made them both freeze. The sound of a car engine, growing closer despite the storm. Harold moved to a gap between the barn's warped boards and peered out into the darkness. "Headlights," he said quietly. "Coming up the old access road." Margaret quickly began stuffing the documents back into the metal box. Whatever was happening, whoever was coming, she knew with absolute certainty that they couldn't be found here. Not with this evidence. Not with these revelations still burning in her mind like brands. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. "Now." But as Harold moved toward the barn door, it swung open with a groan, and a figure stepped out of the storm. The rain drummed against the barn's weathered walls with increasing intensity as Margaret clutched the yellowed photograph in her trembling hands. The face staring back at her was unmistakably her own, yet the woman in the picture wore clothes from decades before Margaret's supposed birth. Harold stood frozen beside her, his weathered features pale in the dim light filtering through the broken boards. "This can't be real," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Look at the date on the back, 1952. I wasn't even born until 1955. Harold took the photograph with careful fingers, squinting at the faded ink. Margaret Rose Whitmore, age 16, Millbrook County Fair. He looked up at his wife of 43 years. "Your maiden name was Crawford, not Whitmore." The silence between them stretched taut as piano wire. Margaret's mind raced through fragments of memory, the foggy recollections of her earliest years, the way her adoptive parents had always seemed nervous when she asked about her past, the medical records that never quite seemed to add up. "There's more," Harold said quietly, reaching for another bundle of papers tucked deeper in the wooden crate. His hands shook as he unfolded what appeared to be official documents. Birth certificate for Margaret Rose Whitmore, born 1936. Death certificate. His voice caught. Death certificate, dated 1954. Margaret sank onto an overturned milk crate, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. At 68, carrying this impossible child, she felt as though reality itself was unraveling. Someone with my face died in 1954, 2 years before I was supposedly born. How is that possible? Thunder crashed overhead and a fresh leak opened in the roof, sending water dripping steadily into a rusty bucket someone had left behind decades ago. Harold continued rifling through the papers, his expression growing more troubled with each document he examined. "Here's something else," he said, holding up a manila folder marked with official state seals. "Experimental Medical Program, Millbrook County, 1950 to 1960. Authorized by," he paused, his face draining of color, "Dr. Edmund Thorne." Margaret's blood ran cold. Dr. Thorne had been their family physician for over 30 years, the man who had delivered their children, who had been treating Margaret throughout this inexplicable pregnancy. The same Dr. Thorne who claimed to be investigating the medical impossibility of their situation. "Let me see that," Margaret demanded, struggling to her feet. The folder contained dozens of pages, most marked with heavy black redactions, but enough text remained visible to paint a disturbing picture. Subject transfers, memory modification protocols, age regression studies. "Harold," Margaret's voice was hollow with growing horror. "What if I'm not who we think I am? What if this pregnancy isn't some miracle or medical anomaly? What if it's connected to whatever happened to the real Margaret Whitmore?" Outside, the storm seemed to be growing worse, as if nature itself was responding to the secrets being unearthed in the abandoned barn. Harold pulled his wife close, feeling the strange warmth emanating from her belly where their impossible child grew. "We need to get these documents to someone," he said firmly. "Someone we can trust. Not Dr. Thorne, anyone but him." Margaret nodded, then froze as another memory surfaced, this one sharper than the foggy recollections of her childhood. "The farmhouse," she said suddenly. "I remember this farmhouse, not from driving by it. I remember living here. The kitchen with the blue curtains, the creaky step third from the top, the way the morning light came through the bedroom window." Harold studied her face in the dim light. "That's impossible, Margaret. This place has been abandoned since before we moved to the county." "Has it?" Margaret challenged, her voice gaining strength. "Or is that just what we were told? What if the real Margaret Whitmore lived here? What if something happened to her, something that Dr. Thorne was involved in, and I was brought in as a replacement?" The implications hung between them like a loaded gun. If Margaret wasn't who she thought she was, then everything about their life together was built on a foundation of lies. Their children, their marriage, their entire shared history, all of it called into question by the contents of a wooden crate hidden in a forgotten corner of an abandoned barn. "The baby," Harold said quietly, his hand moving protectively to Margaret's belly. "If this is all connected, if Dr. Thorne has been manipulating things from the beginning, then what does he want with our child?" Margaret felt the baby shift inside her, as if responding to their conversation. Whatever was growing within her felt both foreign and familiar, as impossible as her own fractured identity. "We need to leave," she said urgently, gathering the most important documents. "Now, before he realizes we've found this place." But as they moved toward the barn door, the sound of car engines cut through the storm, headlights beginning to sweep across the farmhouse walls. The leather journal felt cold against Margaret's trembling fingers as she opened it by the flickering lantern light. Harold stood behind her, his breathing shallow, while rain continued its relentless assault on the barn's weathered roof. The first page bore a date from 43 years ago, written in careful script, June 15th, 1980. She arrived today. Margaret's heart hammered as she read the words aloud, her voice barely audible above the storm. Harold moved closer, squinting at the faded ink. "Dr. Whitmore says the procedure was successful. The girl remembers nothing of her life before. The experimental treatments have taken hold completely. She believes herself to be Margaret Caldwell, age 25, recently moved to town. Her real identity as Sarah Chen, daughter of the murdered family, has been erased." The journal slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the hay-strewn floor. She stared at the wall, unseeing, as fragments of impossible memories began to surface, flashes of a different childhood, different faces, a different name, whispered in the darkness. "That's not possible," Harold whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "Margaret, you remember your childhood, your parents, your sister in California." She turned to face him, and he stepped back at what he saw in her eyes. "Do I, Harold? Do I really? Or do I remember what they planted in my mind?" Harold shook his head violently. "This is insane. You're Margaret Caldwell. You've always been Margaret Caldwell. I married you 38 years ago. I know who you are." But even as he spoke, Margaret was remembering other things. The way certain foods made her inexplicably nauseous, the nightmares she'd had for decades about faceless figures in white coats, the strange scars on her scalp that she'd always attributed to a childhood accident she could never quite recall clearly. She picked up the journal again, her hands steadier now, and continued reading. The entries detailed months of psychiatric treatment, memory implantation, identity reconstruction. Dr. Whitmore had been thorough, documenting every session where Sarah Chen was systematically erased, and Margaret Caldwell was born. "The subject shows remarkable adaptability," one entry read. "The trauma of witnessing her family's murder has been completely suppressed. She now fully believes in the implanted memories of a happy childhood in Ohio. The personality integration appears complete." "The Chen family," Margaret said softly, pieces clicking into place. The newspaper clipping mentioned the Chen family. That was my family. Harold sat heavily on a hay bale, his face pale in the lantern light. "Margaret, listen to yourself. You're talking about false memories and government conspiracies. This is crazy." But Margaret was already flipping through more pages, finding photographs tucked between entries, pictures of a young Asian woman who looked exactly like Margaret had at 25, but wearing different clothes, standing in unfamiliar locations. In one photo, the woman, Sarah, stood with an older Asian couple and two young men, all smiling at the camera. "My brothers," she whispered, touching their faces in the photograph. "I had brothers." The barn seemed to spin around her as more memories surfaced, real memories fighting against the false ones that had been so carefully constructed. She remembered the night they died, the sound of breaking glass, her mother's scream cut short, the taste of blood in her mouth as she hid in the closet. And then, nothing. Nothing until she woke up in what she'd always believed was a hospital after a car accident, with no memory of the previous weeks and a head full of someone else's life. "The baby," she said suddenly, her hand flying to her swollen abdomen. "Harold, what if the baby isn't impossible at all? What if they're still experimenting on me?" Harold's face crumpled. "Don't say that. Please don't say that." Margaret found the final entry in the journal, dated just 6 months ago. "Subject M has been selected for Phase 2. The pregnancy hormone treatments have been administered successfully. Dr. Reeves has assured me that this time we'll be able to monitor the entire process from conception to birth. The child will be the first of its kind, a perfect fusion of human DNA and our enhanced genetic material." The journal fell from her nerveless fingers again as Margaret doubled over, clutching her stomach. Not from pain, but from the horrifying realization of what she was carrying. "They've been watching us, Harold. All these years they've been watching us. This pregnancy, our whole life together, none of it's real." Harold knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms despite his own shock. "You're real to me," he said fiercely. "I don't care what they did or what name you were born with. You're real to me." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. But inside the barn, Margaret felt as though her entire world had just been torn apart and rebuilt in a single night. Everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie, and the child growing inside her was part of some monstrous experiment that had been decades in the making. The question now was, who else knew the truth? The rain drummed against the barn's weathered roof as Margaret stared at the yellowed newspaper, clipping in Harold's trembling hands. The headline read, "Local Girl Missing After Hospital Fire, 1975. Below it, a grainy photograph showed a young woman with familiar eyes and the same delicate curve of jaw that Margaret recognized from her own mirror. "That's not possible," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, fragments of suppressed memories began surfacing like debris after a flood. The smell of antiseptic, screaming, someone calling a name that wasn't quite hers but felt right somehow. Harold's face had gone ashen. "Margaret, look at the name." She forced her eyes to focus on the text below the photograph. Maria Elena Vasquez, age 19, disappeared during the chaos of the fire at St. Catherine's Hospital. Authorities believe she may have suffered amnesia from smoke inhalation. The newspaper crinkled as Margaret's hands began to shake. "That's not me. That can't be me. I'm Margaret Thompson. I've always been Margaret Thompson." But Harold was already reaching for another document from the metal box. This one, an official-looking form with multiple stamps and signatures. "Birth certificate," he said quietly, "for Maria Elena Vasquez. Born March 15th, 1955, Margaret's birthday, her exact birthday." The barn seemed to spin around them. Outside, thunder crashed overhead, and she felt the baby shift inside her, as if responding to her distress. How was any of this possible? The pregnancy, the memories that felt both foreign and familiar, and now this revelation that her entire identity might be built on lies. "There's more," Harold said, his voice barely audible above the storm. He pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The top envelope bore the careful handwriting of someone who had labored over each word. "For my daughter, when she remembers." Margaret's chest tightened. "Harold, I can't. This is too much." "We have to know," he said gently, though she could see the fear in his eyes too. "Whatever's happening to us, whatever this pregnancy means, it's connected to this. It has to be." With shaking fingers, Margaret untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The paper was delicate, threatening to crumble at her touch. "Mi querida Maria," she read aloud, her voice catching on the unfamiliar Spanish words that somehow felt right on her tongue. "If you are reading this, then the memories have returned, and you know the truth about who you are." The handwriting blurred as tears she didn't understand filled her eyes. Harold moved closer, placing his arm around her shoulders as she continued reading. "I know they told you I was dead. I know they gave you a new name, a new life, after the fire took your memories. But I have been searching for you for 48 years. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am your mother." The letter slipped from Margaret's fingers, fluttering to the barn floor like a dying moth. "My mother died when I was young," she said automatically, reciting the story she'd always known to be true. "Car accident. I was raised by my grandmother until she died, then went into foster care." Harold picked up the letter, scanning the rest of its contents. "She says here that you were pregnant when the fire happened, that you lost the baby, and the trauma combined with the smoke inhalation caused severe amnesia. The hospital, they told her you had died in the fire." Margaret felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. What kind of hospital tells a mother her child is dead when she isn't? "The kind that has something to hide," Harold said grimly. He reached for another document from the box. "Look at this." It was a medical record, partially burned around the edges but still legible. Margaret could make out her own vital statistics, the name Maria Elena Vasquez at the top, and in the notes section, a single line that made her blood freeze. "Subject suitable for memory reconstruction program. Recommend immediate transfer to secondary facility." "Memory reconstruction program?" Margaret repeated the words like they were in a foreign language. "What does that mean?" Harold's jaw was clenched tight. "It means someone wanted you to forget who you were. And they succeeded." Outside, lightning illuminated the barn's interior in stark white flashes, casting their shadows long and distorted against the walls. Margaret placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling the impossible life moving within her. If she wasn't who she thought she was, if her entire past was a lie constructed by people who had stolen her memories and her identity, then what did that mean for this baby? "Harold," she said slowly, a new fear creeping into her voice. "If they did this to me once, if they took away my memories and my life, what's to stop them from doing it again?" The storm raged harder, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a car engine cut through the night. The photograph trembled in Margaret's weathered hands as lightning illuminated the barn's interior once more. The face staring back at her was unmistakably her own, but younger, perhaps 25, wearing a white dress she had no memory of ever owning. Beside her stood a man she didn't recognize, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling with the radiant joy of newlyweds. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Harold, I've never seen this man before in my life." Harold moved closer, squinting at the photograph in the dim light. His face had gone pale, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor she'd never heard before. "Margaret, look at the back." With shaking fingers, she turned the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, June 15th, 1978. Our new beginning." The date hit her like a physical blow. June 15th, 1978, 3 months before she claimed to have met Harold. 3 months before what she had always believed was the beginning of her adult life. "Whitmore," Harold repeated slowly. "Your maiden name was Sullivan. You told me you'd never been married before." Margaret's mind reeled. She searched desperately through her memories, but everything before meeting Harold remained frustratingly blank, as if someone had carefully erased entire years from her mind. "I remember meeting you at the library," she said frantically. "September 1978. You were reading Hemingway, and I was shelving books in the literature section. That's my first clear memory of anything, really." "What do you mean, anything?" Harold's voice was sharp now, tinged with fear. Margaret pressed her palm against her forehead, trying to push past the strange fog that seemed to shroud her early memories. "I always thought it was just because nothing important happened before I met you. But Harold, I can't remember my childhood. I can't remember my parents or school or where I lived before our apartment." The barn fell silent except for the rain drumming against the roof. Harold stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "You told me your parents died when you were young. You said you grew up in foster care." "Did I?" Margaret's voice cracked. I suppose I must have, but I don't actually remember saying that. I don't remember anything about foster care or parents or this Thomas Whitmore." She looked down at the photograph again, studying the woman who wore her face. "But this is me. I know it's me." Harold began pacing in the small space, his shoes scuffing against the old floorboards. "People don't just forget entire decades of their lives, Margaret. Not without some kind of trauma or medical condition or what?" she demanded, though part of her dreaded the answer. He stopped pacing and met her eyes. "Or someone made them forget." Thunder crashed overhead, and Margaret instinctively placed her hands over her impossible pregnancy. The baby had been moving more frequently tonight, as if responding to her emotional turmoil. "You think someone deliberately took my memories?" "I think we need to look through the rest of these boxes." Harold's voice had taken on a grim determination. "If there are more photographs, more documents, maybe we can piece together what happened to you." They worked in tense silence, Harold using his phone's flashlight to illuminate their search. Most of the boxes contained old farming equipment and moth-eaten clothing, but in the third box, Margaret's fingers closed around something that made her blood run cold. It was a medical bracelet, the kind worn by patients in psychiatric facilities. Engraved on the metal plate was a name, Margaret Whitmore, and a date, admitted October 15th, 1978. "Harold," she breathed, holding up the bracelet. The metal felt ice-cold against her skin. He took it from her, examining the inscription in the phone's harsh light. "October 1978, just after you claimed to have met me. What if I didn't meet you at the library?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. What if that's just another false memory? Before Harold could respond, they heard the sound of a car engine approaching through the storm. Headlights swept across the barn walls as a vehicle pulled up outside. Harold quickly turned off his phone, plunging them back into darkness. "Who would be out here in this storm?" Margaret whispered. The car doors slammed shut, and they could hear voices approaching. Two men, their words indistinct but their tone urgent. Harold grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her toward the back of the barn, where old hay bales created a natural hiding place. As they crouched behind the mouldy straw, still clutching the photograph and medical bracelet, Margaret felt a strange certainty settle over her. Whoever was approaching knew about this place, knew about the secrets hidden in these boxes, and somehow she was sure they had come for her. The photograph trembled in Margaret's weathered hands as the storm continued its relentless assault on the barn's weathered walls. The young woman staring back at her from the faded image wore her face, but the eyes held a wildness Margaret had never seen in her own mirror. Harold leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear as he studied the picture. "The resemblance is uncanny," he whispered, though they both knew it was more than mere resemblance. The woman in the photograph was Margaret. Yet somehow it wasn't. The clothing suggested the 1970s, but Margaret's memories of that decade were filled with raising their children, not whatever dark purpose had brought her to this isolated place. Margaret set the photograph aside with shaking fingers and reached for the leather journal beneath it. The cover was soft with age, and when she opened it, the musty smell of old paper filled her nostrils. The handwriting on the first page was unmistakably hers, though she had no memory of forming these words. "Day 1 of the program," she read aloud, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They say the procedure will help me forget. Dr. Whitmore promises that when it's over, I'll have a new life, a clean slate. But I'm scared. What if I forget who I really am?" Harold's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Keep reading." Margaret turned the page, her heart hammering against her ribs. Day 5. "The injections make me drowsy, but I can still think clearly enough to write. They've shown me photographs of Harold Chen, the man who will become my husband. He seems kind. They say he's part of the program too, though he doesn't know it. None of the subjects know about the others." The barn suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the implications crashed over them. Harold pulled away, his face pale in the lantern light. "I don't understand. What program? What subjects?" Margaret's voice cracked as she continued reading. Day 12. Dr. Whitmore explained the true purpose today. "We're not just test subjects for memory modification, we're carriers. Each couple in the program has been selected for specific genetic markers. The children we'll have will be different, special, but they need us to believe our lives are normal, that our love is real." "Stop!" Harold stood abruptly, backing away from her. "This is impossible. Our children, our grandchildren, they're normal, they're ours." But Margaret couldn't stop. The words pulled her forward like a current she was powerless to resist. Day 18. "The final procedure is tomorrow. After that, I won't remember being Sarah Mitchell. I'll only know myself as Margaret Chen. They've created an entire history for us. How we met, our courtship, our wedding. Even our wedding photos are fabricated. Harold will wake up tomorrow believing we've been married for 3 years, and I'll believe it too." The journal slipped from her numb fingers, falling to the hay-strewn floor. Outside, lightning illuminated the barn's interior in stark, terrible clarity. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, and Margaret wondered if anything she'd ever known was real. Harold slowly sank back down beside her, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. "Sarah Mitchell," he repeated. "Do you remember anything? Anything at all about being her?" Margaret closed her eyes, searching the dark corners of her mind for some trace of the woman she'd apparently once been. For a moment, there was nothing but the familiar landscape of her memories with Harold, their first apartment, their children's births, decades of shared joys and sorrows. But then, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, something else began to emerge. A sterile white room, the smell of antiseptic, a man in a lab coat with pale blue eyes, who spoke in soothing tones about new beginnings and necessary sacrifices, and beneath it all, a desperate, clawing fear that she was losing something precious, something irreplaceable. "I remember being afraid," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet Harold's gaze, "not of the procedure, but of losing you. Even before I knew you, somehow I was afraid of losing you." Harold reached for her hand again, his fingers intertwining with hers. "But why now? Why are these memories surfacing? And what does any of this have to do with the baby?" Margaret's free hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the impossible life continued to grow. "The pregnancy. It's not just impossible because of our age. It's impossible because of what they did to us. The modifications, the genetic manipulation. It was never supposed to allow for this." But as Margaret looked into Harold's eyes, she saw her own determination reflected there. Whatever they'd been before, whatever had been done to them, the people they'd become were real. Their love was real. And now, somehow, they were threatening to break free from the program that had created them. The rain hammered against the barn's weathered roof as Margaret clutched the faded photograph, her hands trembling. The woman in the picture looked exactly like her, but the timestamp read 1952, 3 years before Margaret believed she was born. Harold stood behind her, his breathing shallow, waiting for an explanation that seemed impossible to give. "I remember this barn," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Not from today, not from yesterday. From when I was small." She moved toward the corner where they'd found the hidden box, her steps uncertain. There was a swing right there, hanging from that beam. Harold followed her gaze upward. Ancient rope marks scarred the wooden beam, worn grooves that spoke of years of use. "Margaret, what are you saying?" She closed her eyes, fragments of memory surfacing like debris after a flood. "I remember a woman singing to me, lullabies in a language I didn't understand. She had dark hair, darker than mine, and she smelled like lavender and fear." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the impossible pregnancy continued to defy medical explanation. "She used to tell me stories about a place called home, but she never said where that was." The photograph fluttered in her grasp. Behind the woman who looked like Margaret stood a man in uniform, his face stern and unfamiliar. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a child's wooden toy, the same toy they'd found in the buried box. "I think that woman was my mother," Margaret said. "My real mother." Harold's face went pale. "But your parents, the Clarks, found me." The memory came rushing back with startling clarity. "I was 5, maybe 6. They found me here, in this barn, during a storm just like this one. I was alone, hungry, speaking broken English mixed with words no one could understand." She turned to face Harold, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They took me in, gave me a new birthday, a new story. They said my parents had died in a car accident, but I never remembered any accident. I never remembered anything before the barn." The thunder seemed to punctuate her revelation, and in its wake, they heard something else, the sound of a car engine approaching through the storm. Harold moved to the window, peering through the cracked glass. "Someone's coming," he said urgently. Margaret's grip tightened on the photograph. "They know we're here." The car's headlights swept across the barn's interior as it pulled up outside. Harold counted at least 2 figures emerging from the vehicle, their silhouettes moving deliberately through the rain. One of them carried what looked like a briefcase. "Hide the box," Margaret whispered frantically. "Whatever this is, whatever my real identity means, someone doesn't want us to know about it." Harold quickly gathered the scattered documents and photographs, shoving them back into the metal box. He looked around desperately for a hiding place, finally settling on a loose floorboard near the back wall. The wood protested as he pried it up, but he managed to wedge the box into the space beneath just as footsteps approached the barn door. Margaret smoothed her clothes and tried to compose herself, but the knowledge of her true past burned behind her eyes. The pregnancy, the memories, the photograph. Everything was connected in ways she was only beginning to understand. The barn door creaked open, and 2 figures entered, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a younger man wearing glasses. They weren't local police or doctors. These people had an air of authority that suggested federal involvement. "Mrs. Henley," the woman said, her voice professionally calm. "Mr. Henley, we've been looking for you." "We got lost in the storm," Harold said carefully. "Took shelter here." The woman's eyes scanned the barn interior, lingering on the corner where they'd made their discovery. "Of course, though I find it interesting that you chose this particular location." She stepped closer to Margaret, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "You don't remember me, do you, Margaret?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "We met a very long time ago. You were much younger then." The woman opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick file. "Your pregnancy has raised certain flags in our system, flags that led us to review some very old cases." The younger man positioned himself near the door, effectively blocking their exit. "What kind of flags?" Harold demanded. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The kind that suggests Margaret isn't quite as ordinary as she's believed all these years. She opened the file, revealing documents that looked official and ominous. The kind that suggests her pregnancy isn't a medical miracle, it's something far more significant. Margaret felt the walls of her manufactured life crumbling around her. Whatever truth lay buried in her past was about to be exposed, and she sensed that once it came to light, there would be no going back to the simple existence she and Harold had built together. The storm raged on outside, but inside the barn, an even more dangerous tempest was just beginning. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the barn walls. Margaret sat on the hay bale, her hands trembling as she held the faded photograph Harold had found, hidden beneath the loose floorboard. The woman in the image stared back at her with familiar eyes, her own eyes, but the face belonged to someone she had no memory of being. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space. "I would remember something like this." Harold knelt beside the wooden box they'd discovered, carefully lifting out yellowed documents and manila envelopes. Each item seemed to add another layer to a mystery that defied comprehension. Birth certificates with different names, medical records spanning decades, and correspondence addressed to women who might have been Margaret, or might have been someone else entirely. "Here's another one," Harold said, his voice tight with concern. He handed her a letter dated 30 years ago, addressed to someone named Elena Morrison. The handwriting— "Margaret, look at the signature." She examined the letter's closing, and her breath caught in her throat. The signature was unmistakably hers, though she had no recollection of writing the words or even being anyone named Elena. The letter discussed a procedure, something about memory suppression and identity reformation. "Harold, I'm scared." The admission fell from her lips before she could stop it. For 68 years, she had been certain of who she was, where she came from, how she'd built her life. Now, everything felt like it was built on sand, shifting and unreliable beneath her feet. He moved closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We'll figure this out together. We always do." But even as he spoke the comforting words, Margaret could hear the uncertainty in his voice. How could they figure out something that seemed to defy logic? She touched her abdomen, feeling the impossible life growing within her, and wondered if that too was connected to whatever conspiracy had apparently stolen her past. "There's more," Harold said quietly, pulling out a thick medical file. The tab was marked with her current name, Margaret Chen, but the contents dated back to before she could remember meeting Harold, before their marriage, before the life they'd built together. Inside were brain scans, psychological evaluations, and treatment notes in precise handwriting. The documents described a patient recovering from severe trauma-induced amnesia, someone who had undergone experimental memory reconstruction therapy. The attending physician's name was Dr. Samuel Reeves, the same doctor she'd been seeing for her pregnancy. "Oh, God," Margaret gasped, the pieces clicking into place with terrifying clarity. "He's been involved this whole time. Dr. Reeves, our pregnancy, everything." Harold's face darkened as he read over her shoulder. It says here that the patient, you, volunteered for a new identity construction program. But why would anyone choose to forget their entire life? Margaret's mind raced, trying to grasp fragments of memory that seemed to hover just beyond her reach. There were flashes of something, fear, running, the sound of footsteps behind her in the dark. But when she tried to focus on these glimpses, they slipped away like smoke. "Maybe I didn't have a choice," she said slowly. "Maybe something happened, something so terrible that forgetting was the only way to survive." They continued sorting through the documents, each revelation more disturbing than the last. There were photographs of Margaret, or Elena, with people she didn't recognize, in places she'd never been. One image showed her standing next to a man in a white coat, both of them smiling in what appeared to be a laboratory setting. The man looked younger, but she was certain it was Dr. Reeves. "Look at the date," Harold pointed to the back of the photograph. It was marked 25 years ago, but Dr. Reeves looked exactly the same as he did now. This doesn't make sense. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Nothing about their situation made sense anymore. The impossible pregnancy, the missing memories, and now evidence that the doctor treating her might not be who he claimed to be. "We need to leave," she said suddenly, standing up so quickly that spots danced in her vision. "We can't stay here. If Dr. Reeves is involved in whatever happened to me before, then he knows we're here. He probably knows everything." Harold began gathering the most important documents, stuffing them into a canvas bag they'd found in the barn. "Where can we go? If this conspiracy is as big as it seems—" "I don't know," Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength despite her fear. "But I won't let them take my memories again. Whatever I was running from before, whatever made me choose to forget everything, I need to remember. I need to know who I really am." As they prepared to leave the barn, Margaret took one last look at the photograph of herself as Elena Morrison. Somewhere in that stranger's eyes was the key to understanding not just her past, but the impossible future growing within her. Margaret's hands trembled as she held the yellowed birth certificate, the name Catherine Elizabeth Morrison staring back at her like an accusation. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos in her mind, thunder rolling across the sky as if the heavens themselves were protesting this revelation. "This can't be right," she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, fragments of suppressed memories began surfacing like debris after a flood. A woman's voice singing lullabies in a different language, the smell of lavender and something else, fear perhaps. A man's angry shouting, always in the distance, always threatening. Harold moved closer, his weathered face pale in the lantern light. "Margaret, what does this mean? Who was Catherine Morrison?" She closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples as the memories fought their way through decades of carefully constructed barriers. I think Catherine Morrison was me before I became Margaret." The admission hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Harold's breath caught, and she could see him struggling to process this information alongside everything else they'd discovered in the past hour. "The pregnancy," he said slowly. "The dreams you've been having. What if they're not dreams at all? What if they're memories trying to surface?" Margaret's eyes snapped open. The dreams. Yes, they'd been so vivid, so real. A younger version of herself, running through fields, hiding in barns just like this one, always running from something. And in every dream she'd been pregnant, just as impossibly pregnant as she was now. "There's more," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. She reached into the box with shaking hands and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was brittle with age, and the handwriting on the envelopes was feminine, desperate. Harold held the lantern closer as she carefully opened the first letter. The date at the top made her gasp, 50 years ago, almost to the day. "My dearest Catherine," she read aloud, her voice breaking. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I've had to give you the serum. I know you won't remember me, won't remember any of this, But I pray that someday you'll find these letters and understand why I had to take your memories away." Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank onto a hay bale, the letter clutched to her chest. Harold sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, anchoring her to the present as her past threatened to sweep her away. "Read the rest," he urged gently. With trembling fingers, she continued. "The experiments were supposed to help women who couldn't conceive. Dr. Whitmore promised us miracles, and in our desperation we believed him. But the serum did more than restore fertility. It changed us at a cellular level, slowed our aging, extended our lives far beyond what should be possible. The pregnancies, they're not natural, Catherine. They're echoes of what the serum took from us decades ago." Margaret dropped the letter as if it had burned her. "Oh my God, Harold. What did they do to me?" Harold picked up another letter, scanning its contents quickly. "Listen to this. The other women in the experiment have started disappearing. Dr. Whitmore says they've been relocated for their own safety, but I know better. We know too much, and we're living proof of what he's done. I've prepared this hiding place for you, Catherine. When they come for you, and they will, remember that I love you. Remember that everything I did was to protect you. Your loving sister, Ruth." "Sister," Margaret repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "I had a sister named Ruth." More memories crashed over her, a red-haired woman with kind eyes, always protecting her, always one step ahead of the men who came looking for them. "Margaret." Harold's voice was urgent now. "If this is all true, if you were part of some experiment 50 years ago, then the people responsible might still be looking for you. This pregnancy, it's proof that their work succeeded." She looked down at her swollen belly, at the impossible life growing inside her at age 68. But why now? Why after all these years? Harold rifled through more papers in the box, his movements becoming increasingly frantic. "Here," he said, pulling out a scientific journal clipping. "Listen to this headline. Whitmore Foundation announces breakthrough in age reversal research." It's dated last month, Margaret. The implications hit her like a physical blow. They're still doing experiments. They're still out there. And if they've been monitoring you somehow, if they know about the pregnancy— Harold didn't need to finish the sentence. Thunder crashed overhead, but it was the sound of car engines in the distance that made them both freeze. Multiple vehicles moving fast despite the storm, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. Margaret gripped Harold's hand, her heart pounding as the truth settled over them like a shroud. She wasn't just Margaret anymore. She was Catherine Morrison, living proof of experiments that should have been buried decades ago. And now it seemed Dr. Whitmore's successors had finally found her. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret's knees buckled, and Harold caught her before she could fall completely. The barn seemed to spin around them, as the weight of Sister Catherine's words settled into their bones. "You're lying," Margaret whispered. But even as she spoke, fragments of buried memories began surfacing like debris after a flood. The strange dreams that had plagued her for decades, the inexplicable fear of hospitals, the way certain lullabies made her weep without understanding why. Sister Catherine's weathered face crumpled with grief. "I've carried this burden for 47 years, Margaret. Every day I've wondered if I made the right choice." "What choice?" Harold's voice was sharp with protective anger. "What gave you the right to steal a baby?" "She was dying." The old nun's voice cracked. "The real Margaret Whitmore was born with a heart defect. The doctors said she had hours, maybe days. When Elizabeth Hawthorne brought you here, bleeding, terrified, barely more than a child herself, and you gave birth on the same night." She shook her head. It seemed like divine providence. Margaret pressed her hands to her temples, feeling as though her skull might split open. "My mother, Elizabeth, she gave me away?" She was 16 and unmarried. Her father would have killed her if he'd known. "She came here in secret, planning to leave you with us and return home. But when the Whitmore baby died and Mrs. Whitmore was sedated with grief, I saw an opportunity to save everyone." The implications crashed over Margaret like a tsunami. She thought of the woman she'd called mother for 68 years, cold, distant Dorothy Whitmore who had never seemed capable of maternal warmth. It all made terrible sense now. "The DNA tests," Harold said suddenly. "Margaret's blood work for the pregnancy. Won't they show she's not who she thinks she is?" Sister Catherine nodded grimly. "That's why Dr. Morrison has been asking so many questions. He's already suspicious. The blood type discrepancies, the genetic markers that don't match the Whitmore family medical history on file." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly. "And the baby. What does this mean for the baby?" "I don't know." Sister Catherine's honesty was brutal. "But I suspect your true parentage might explain some of the unusual circumstances surrounding your pregnancy." A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "It explains everything." They spun toward the barn entrance, where Dr. Morrison stood silhouetted against the storm, his usually pristine appearance disheveled. Rain dripped from his coat, and his eyes held a wildness that made Harold step protectively in front of Margaret. "How long have you been listening?" Sister Catherine demanded. "Long enough." Dr. Morrison stepped inside, shaking rain from his hair. "Long enough to understand why Margaret's genetic markers have been giving me sleepless nights." Margaret felt the world tilt again. "What are you talking about?" "Your real mother, Elizabeth Hawthorne. Do you know what happened to her after she left here?" Sister Catherine's face went pale. "She moved away, started a new life." "She moved to Millbrook," Dr. Morrison said softly. "Changed her name to Elizabeth Morrison. Became my grandmother." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless pounding of rain on the barn roof. Margaret's legs gave out completely this time, and Harold lowered her gently to an old hay bale. "Your grandmother?" Harold's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Morrison nodded, his professional composure finally cracking. "She told stories about a baby she'd given up. I never believed them, thought they were just the ramblings of an old woman. But when I ran Margaret's blood work and saw markers I recognized from my own family's genetic profile," Margaret looked up at him with hollow eyes. "You're my nephew. Your great-nephew, actually." "And Margaret." He knelt beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "The genetic anomaly that's allowing your pregnancy, it runs in our family, has for generations. Women who can conceive well past normal age, carrying children that seem to accelerate certain evolutionary traits." "You're talking about the other children," Sister Catherine whispered. "The ones from the laboratory." Dr. Morrison's head snapped up. "What laboratory?" But before anyone could answer, the barn doors suddenly slammed shut with a resonating crash that seemed too forceful to be caused by the wind. The ancient padlock they'd broken to enter had somehow reformed itself, the metal links gleaming as if newly forged. Harold rushed to the doors, pushing against them with his full weight, but they wouldn't budge. "We're locked in." Outside, the storm's fury seemed to intensify, but underneath the howling wind, they could hear something else. The sound of vehicles approaching, engines cutting through the night like mechanical predators. Margaret struggled to her feet, one hand on her belly. The baby was moving restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. "They've found us." Dr. Morrison pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. Who's found us?" Sister Catherine's voice was barely audible above the storm. "The people who've been watching Margaret her whole life. The ones who've been waiting for this pregnancy." The journal trembled in Margaret's hands as she read the final entry, dated just 3 days before her supposed birth. Dr. Whitmore's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic, his desperation bleeding through every stroke of the pen. "The procedure is complete. Subject 7 shows remarkable adaptation to the genetic modifications. Unlike the others, she appears to be thriving. The cellular regeneration is beyond our wildest projections. She may live for centuries, but the government wants to terminate the project. They're coming tomorrow. I cannot let them destroy what we've created. She deserves a chance at life, at normalcy." Harold's breathing had grown labored beside her. "Margaret, we need to leave. Now." But she couldn't stop reading. The truth was finally within reach, and she needed to understand what she was, what they had made her into. The next page contained detailed charts of her genetic structure, noting abnormalities that she now recognized as the source of her impossible pregnancy. Her body wasn't just designed to live longer, it was designed to adapt, to overcome biological limitations that constrained normal humans. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to a notation in the margin. "He says the modifications include enhanced fertility that activates during times of extreme stress or threat. It's not a pregnancy, Harold. It's something else entirely." The sound of vehicles approaching cut through the storm's fury, multiple engines moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. Harold grabbed the journal from her hands and shoved it into his jacket. "Whatever you are, whoever created you, they're here," he said, pulling her toward the back of the barn. "We need to find another way out." But it was too late. Floodlights blazed through the barn's broken windows, casting long shadows across the laboratory equipment. The main door burst open, and armed figures in tactical gear poured in. Margaret felt a strange calm descend over her as she watched them spread out, their weapons trained on every corner. "Dr. Whitmore's final experiment," a woman's voice called out from behind the lights. "Still alive after all these years. Remarkable." A figure stepped forward, middle-aged, wearing a crisp black suit despite the storm. Her smile was cold and calculating. "Hello, Subject 7. Or should I call you Margaret? Such a quaint name for a billion-dollar government asset." "I'm not your asset," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm a human being with a life, a family." "Are you, though?" The woman gestured to one of her men, who began setting up some kind of scanning equipment. "Our records indicate you've never been sick, never shown signs of aging beyond your 20s until recently, never even had so much as a broken bone. And now, at 68, you're experiencing cellular regeneration that should be impossible." Harold stepped protectively in front of Margaret. "Leave her alone. She's done nothing wrong." "Mr. Chen, isn't it?" The woman's smile widened. 43 years of marriage to a woman who never aged, never changed, and you never questioned it? How remarkably unobservant." The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had always looked young for her age, had always been healthy, had always healed quickly from minor injuries. She'd attributed it to good genes, to fortune. But Harold must have noticed, must have wondered. She turned to look at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The way he sometimes stared at her with confusion, the questions he'd start to ask before stopping himself, the careful way he'd always avoided discussing her unusual health and vitality. "You knew," she whispered, "didn't you? You've known something was different about me." Harold's face crumpled. "I suspected. But I loved you, Margaret. I've always loved you, no matter what you were." The scanner began beeping rapidly, and the woman checked its display with satisfaction. "Cellular activity is off the charts. The pregnancy, or whatever we're calling this metamorphosis, has accelerated her abilities exponentially. She's exactly what we've been waiting for." "Waiting for what?" Margaret demanded. "The project never ended, my dear. We've been watching you, studying you from a distance, waiting for the right moment to bring you home. Dr. Whitmore thought he was saving you, but he was simply giving you time to mature into your full potential. And now, with this new development, you're ready to fulfill your true purpose." Margaret felt something shifting inside her, a power she'd never recognized before beginning to stir. The child, or whatever it was, seemed to pulse with energy, connecting her to something vast and incomprehensible. "I won't go with you," she said, and as she spoke, the lights in the barn began to flicker. The scanning equipment sparked and went silent. The woman's expression shifted from confidence to concern. "Fascinating. The emotional stress is triggering defensive mechanisms we didn't even know existed." Around them, the laboratory equipment began to hum with electrical energy, responding to Margaret's presence in ways that defied explanation. She was no longer just the subject of an experiment. She was becoming something else entirely. The rain hammered against the barn's weathered walls as Margaret clutched the faded photograph in trembling hands. The woman in the picture shared her eyes, her nose, the same determined set of her jaw, but wore a stranger's clothes, stood in an unfamiliar garden, held a baby that couldn't possibly be her. "This isn't real," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, fragments of buried memories began surfacing like debris after a flood. A woman's voice singing lullabies in a language she couldn't name, the scent of jasmine and cigarette smoke, hands braiding her hair while telling stories of princes and magical forests. Harold moved closer, his weathered face etched with concern. "Margaret, what is it? What did you find?" She couldn't speak. The implications crashed over her in waves. If this photograph was real, if the documents scattered across the barn floor were authentic, then everything, her childhood, her parents, her entire identity, was a carefully constructed lie. The baby inside her shifted restlessly, as if sensing her turmoil. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, wondering how this impossible child fit into the puzzle. Was this pregnancy somehow connected to whatever truth lay buried in this decrepit barn? "Look at this," Harold said softly, kneeling beside a metal strongbox they'd pried open. Inside, beneath layers of oilcloth, were more photographs, official documents, and what appeared to be correspondence between two people using code names. His voice grew strained. "Margaret, I think you might have been adopted. Or taken." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Taken. Not adopted through proper channels, not rescued from poverty or abandonment, but stolen. Margaret sank onto a bale of hay, her mind reeling as she tried to process the magnitude of what they discovered. "The Kowalski farm," she murmured, remembering the property records they'd found earlier. This was their land. They owned this barn, this property, for 40 years before selling it to she caught herself, before selling it to the Hartmans. Harold's expression darkened as understanding dawned. "The couple who raised you, the people you thought were your parents." Margaret nodded numbly. The pregnancy suddenly felt more significant, more purposeful. Had some cosmic force guided them to this place during the storm? Was their impossible child somehow meant to uncover this decades-old secret? Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief illumination of lightning, she saw Harold examining a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. His face went ashen as he read. "What is it?" she asked. "These are letters between your adoptive mother and someone named Dr. Brennan. They're discussing payment, large sums of money, and there's mention of ensuring the girl never remembers." Harold's voice cracked. "Margaret, I think they did something to your memory, some kind of treatment or procedure to make you forget your early childhood." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her inability to recall anything before age 6, the migraines that had plagued her teenage years whenever she tried to remember earlier times, the strange dreams that felt more like memories, dreams her adoptive parents had always dismissed as childhood fantasies. "The woman in the photograph," Margaret said, studying the image again. "She's my real mother, isn't she? And that baby—" her breath caught. "That baby is me." Harold found more documents, birth certificates, both original and falsified, medical records, even newspaper clippings about a young Polish immigrant family whose infant daughter had gone missing from a hospital in 1954. The child was never found. The parents, devastated and unable to afford continued searching, had eventually returned to Europe. "Maria Kowalski," Margaret read from the birth certificate. "That's my real name. My parents were Stanislaw and Anna Kowalski." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't Margaret Hartman, respected member of the community, retired teacher with a quiet, unremarkable life. She was Maria Kowalski, a stolen child whose real parents had probably died, never knowing what happened to her. Another contraction rippled through her abdomen, stronger than before. The baby was coming, whether they were ready or not. But now, in this place where her true identity had been revealed, the timing felt significant, rather than merely inconvenient. "Harold!" she gasped, gripping his arm. "The baby! I think it's time." He looked around the barn desperately, as if searching for medical equipment that clearly wasn't there. "We need to get you to a hospital. The storm—" No, she said firmly, surprised by her own certainty. Here, the baby wants to be born here, where the truth finally came out. As another wave of pain washed over her, Maria, felt something profound shifting inside her, beyond just the child preparing to enter the world. She was reclaiming not just her identity, but her strength. The frightened, confused woman who'd entered this barn was transforming into someone else entirely, someone who wouldn't let this secret die with her. The rain had stopped, but Margaret could still hear water dripping from the barn's broken gutters into puddles below. Harold's breathing had grown steady beside her, though she knew he wasn't really sleeping. Neither of them had slept since finding the photographs hidden beneath the loose floorboard, images of her as a child, documents bearing a name she'd never known was hers, and a birth certificate that made her entire life feel like a carefully constructed lie. Elena Vasquez. That was who she really was. The baby moved inside her, a gentle flutter that should have been impossible at 68. But then again, everything about the last few days had been impossible. The pregnancy, the storm that drove them to this particular barn, the discovery that her parents, the people who raised her, had stolen her from another family 59 years ago. Margaret, Harold's voice was rough in the darkness. We need to decide what we're going to do. She turned toward him, barely able to make out his silhouette in the dim light filtering through the broken roof. What do you mean? The real Elena's family. They might still be alive. They might still be looking for her, for you. Margaret pressed her hand to her swollen belly. The child inside her kicked, as if responding to the weight of secrets being unraveled. I don't know if I can handle any more truth right now. Harold sat up, his joints creaking audibly. Look at this. He held up a yellowed newspaper clipping they'd found with the other documents. Elena Vasquez, age 9, disappeared from Santa Rosa Children's Home, 1964, last seen with visiting family friends, Robert and Catherine Mills. Those were her parents' names, the people who had raised her, loved her, given her a life full of warmth and stability, the people who had apparently kidnapped her. There's more, Harold continued, his voice barely above a whisper. This home, Santa Rosa, it was investigated multiple times for illegal adoptions, children who disappeared into the system, records that were falsified. He paused. Margaret, I think your parents weren't the only ones involved. The implications crashed over her like the storm that had brought them here. How many other children, how many other families destroyed by this conspiracy of theft and lies? The baby, she whispered. Harold, what if this baby isn't ours? What if it's some kind of punishment or justice? He reached for her hand in the darkness. Don't talk like that. This child is ours, no matter how impossible it seems. Just like you're mine, no matter what name you were born with. But Margaret could feel something shifting inside her, beyond the baby's movements. A recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. The dreams I've been having, the ones that started when I got pregnant, they weren't dreams at all, were they? They were memories. She had seen flashes of a different childhood, speaking Spanish with an older woman who had kind eyes, playing in a garden filled with tomatoes and marigolds, crying for someone called Abuela who never came back. She dismissed them as pregnancy-induced fantasies, but now she understood they were fragments of Elena's life trying to surface. There's something else, Harold said quietly. He held up a letter, the paper so old it was nearly transparent. This was addressed to Elena Vasquez, but it was never delivered. It's from someone named Carmen. She says she never stopped looking, that she'd love Elena until her dying breath. Margaret's throat tightened. When is it dated? 1995. 31 years after her disappearance. Someone had been looking for her, loving her, grieving for her for 31 years, maybe longer. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Margaret gasped. The movement felt different now, stronger, more purposeful, as if the child inside her was responding to the truth being revealed. Harold, I think we need to find her. Carmen. If she's still alive, she deserves to know what happened to Elena. He squeezed her hand. Are you sure? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Your parents, dead, she finished, and they can't explain why they did what they did. But somewhere out there, a woman has spent 59 years wondering what happened to a little girl she loved. I can give her that answer. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the barn's broken windows, casting everything in pale gold light. Margaret struggled to her feet, Harold supporting her as she rose. Together they gathered the documents, the photographs, the evidence of a life stolen and hidden. As they prepared to leave the barn that had sheltered them through the storm and the revelation, Margaret felt the baby settle into stillness inside her. Whatever force had brought this impossible pregnancy into their lives, whatever cosmic justice or inexplicable miracle was at work, she understood now that it had led them here for a reason. Elena Vasquez was going home at last, carrying new life with her.